September 4th, 476 AD. In a small palace in the Italian city of Ravenna, a 16-year-old boy hands over his crown without a fight. His name is Romulus Augustulus. He is the last emperor of Rome, the final ruler of an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years. No battle, no siege. Just a teenager, a barbarian general named Odoacer, and a quiet handover of power that history would later mark as the end of the ancient world. But here's the question historians still argue about: what if that boy had never surrendered? What if Rome, the empire that built roads still standing today, that gave the world concrete law and the very idea of citizenship, never fell at all? This is not a story of what happened. This is a story of what almost didn't have to. To understand how close Rome came to surviving, you have to understand how impossibly strong it once was. At its height under emperors like Trajan, Rome controlled nearly 5 million square kilometers of territory, from the fog-covered hills of Britain to the deserts of Syria. From the Rhine to the Sahara, some 60 million people lived under Roman law, connected by over 400,000 kilometers of roads. This wasn't a fragile empire clinging to power. It was, for centuries, the most sophisticated state the world had ever produced, with a functioning bureaucracy, a professional army, and cities with running water and public sanitation that Europe would not see again for well over 1,000 years. Historians don't agree on a single reason for Rome's decline. They point to economic strain from endless wars, a currency debased by generations of emperors printing coin to pay soldiers, and a political system so unstable that being emperor became one of history's most dangerous jobs. Dozens assassinated, deposed, or forced into suicide across just the 3rd century alone. Add to that decades of plague, climate shifts disrupting harvests across the Mediterranean, and waves of migrating peoples pressing against Rome's borders: the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, and by the 400s, the western half of the empire was a structure buckling under too much weight for too long. But buckling is not the same as inevitable collapse, and that distinction is where this story truly begins. Historians who study this question point to a handful of moments where Rome's fate could plausibly have tipped the other way. The first, the Battle of Adrianople, 378 AD. A Roman army led personally by Emperor Valens is annihilated by Gothic forces in what many historians consider the beginning of the end. Valens himself is killed. Two-thirds of his army dies with him. It is one of Rome's worst military disasters in centuries, and it convinces the Goths for the first time that the empire could be beaten in open battle. If Valens had waited for reinforcements already marching toward him, reinforcements led by his own nephew, the future Emperor Gratian, the outcome could have been decisively different. Instead, driven by pride and the desire for a solo victory, Valens attacked early, the second fork, the division of the empire itself. By 395 AD, Rome permanently splits into a western and eastern half. The Eastern Empire, centered on the wealthy, well-defended city of Constantinople, will go on to survive for another 1,000 years, eventually known to history as the Byzantine Empire. The West, poorer, more exposed, and stripped of resources, will not last a century. A united empire, historians argue, pooling the wealth of the East with the military manpower of the West, might have weathered the barbarian migrations that the divided West could not. The third, the sack of Rome itself in 410 AD by the Visigothic king Alaric, the first time in nearly 800 years that the city of Rome had fallen to a foreign army. It didn't destroy the empire outright, but it shattered something psychological. If Rome itself could be taken, what couldn't be? Each of these moments was a door. Rome walked through all three in the wrong direction. So imagine now a different door. Imagine Valens waits. Imagine the empire holds together as one. Imagine Rome, battered but unbroken, absorbs the Gothic migrations the way it once absorbed dozens of conquered peoples before them, not as an existential threat, but as new citizens, new soldiers. New taxpayers, the same strategy that built the empire in the first place. What might centuries of an unbroken Rome actually look like? Historians who engage with this question carefully and always labeled as speculation point to a few plausible threads. Rome's engineering culture, the same one that built aqueducts still functioning 2,000 years later, might have continued to compound. Roman engineers were already experimenting with early forms of concrete and basic mechanical devices. Some historians speculate that centuries of uninterrupted institutional continuity, without the technological regression of Western Europe's early medieval period, could have accelerated advances that historically took another 1,000 years to reappear. Rome's legal system, the foundation of law across most of modern Europe today, might never have fragmented into the patchwork of feudal customary law that defined the medieval period. A single, continuous legal tradition, refined over a millennium longer than it actually was. And Rome's road network, its postal system, its common currency across an enormous, connected territory, the infrastructure of trade and communication that took Europe over 1,000 years to rebuild after Rome's fall, might simply have never been lost at all. This is, of course, speculation built on speculation. No historian can tell you with certainty what a Rome that never fell would have actually built, but the fall of Rome didn't just end an empire. It erased infrastructure, knowledge, and institutional continuity that took the Western world centuries to claw back. Instead, history took the other road. By the mid-400s, the Western Empire is a shell of what it once was, controlled in practice by barbarian generals wielding puppet emperors, its territory shrinking with every passing decade. Its treasury empty, its legions increasingly made up of the very peoples it once conquered. In 476 AD, one of those generals, Odoacer, decides the puppet show isn't worth continuing. He deposes the teenage Emperor Romulus Augustulus, whose name is a small, bitter historical irony since he shares it with Rome's mythical founder, Romulus, 11 centuries earlier. The empire that began with one Romulus ends with another. Odoacer doesn't even bother naming a new emperor. He simply sends the imperial regalia to Constantinople, a symbolic admission that the West no longer needs the fiction of its own throne. There is no final battle, no last stand. Just paperwork and a boy sent quietly into retirement. The Eastern Empire, richer, better fortified, more centrally organized, survives. It will go on to call itself Roman for another 1,000 years, until Constantinople itself finally falls to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, but the West is gone. And with it goes the connective tissue of an entire civilization. The roads fall into disrepair, literacy rates collapse across most of the former empire. Trade networks fracture into isolated regional economies, and Europe enters the period historians once called, bluntly, the Dark Ages. It would take the better part of 1,000 years for parts of Europe to rebuild what an unbroken Rome might simply have kept. Here is the uncomfortable truth beneath every what if about Rome. Empires don't usually die from a single killing blow. They die from decades of small decisions, each one survivable on its own, that eventually stack into something no longer survivable at all. Valens didn't have to attack that day at Adrianople. The empire didn't have to divide the way it did. Rome didn't have to lose its ability to absorb the very peoples pressing against its borders. None of these were inevitabilities. They were choices, accidents, and moments of pride, the kind that shape empires and individuals alike. We'll never know what a Rome that made different choices could have built. But we do know what was lost when it didn't. 1,000 years of continuity erased almost overnight that the rest of the world spent the next 1,000 years trying to rebuild. Maybe that's the real lesson hiding inside this counterfactual. Not that Rome should have survived, but that nothing, no matter how vast or permanent it appears, survives on size alone. It survives on the decisions made in the moments when it looked like it still had a choice. So, if Rome had never fallen, what do you think the modern world would look like today? Let me know your theory in the comments.